So in identifying priorities for conservation, there's two big questions: which species to protect and which areas to protect. And I'm here with Stuart Butchart from BirdLife International. So Stu, we've in the past we've just said these are the important areas. We know which are the important areas. Why isn't that good enough?
Well, there are two challenges in setting priorities for conservation spatially. The first is that biodiversity is not evenly distributed across the world, and the second is that our threats to nature are not distributed evenly across the world. So the first of those, we know there are many more species in the tropics than there are in temperate areas, both in the northern hemisphere and southern hemisphere. And we also know that some parts of the world are particularly rich in species with very small ranges, so restricted range or endemic species. So places like the eastern arc of Africa, the mountains of the eastern arc, or Madagascar, or many of the world's islands, particularly in the tropics in Southeast Asia or in the Caribbean. And we know that human impacts are not evenly distributed either. There are many more people in some parts of the world, and the human activities are not evenly spread across the world, and so the threats they have to nature are uneven as well.
So then what did you then do about it? What was the solution?
Well, back in the late 1970s, we started developing a set of criteria for identifying the most important locations for conserving the world's birds. And these had a number of criteria related to important places for threatened species, important places for species that had restricted ranges or that were restricted to particular biomes, and places that were particularly important for species that concentrated in large numbers at very specific locations. And we called these sites important bird and biodiversity areas.
And as I remember that paper coming out and the influence it had, and particularly it showed that areas like Indonesia and the Philippines were kind of rather neglected by conservation. It really showed the importance of those in a rigorous scientific manner.
That's right, yeah. And so to enable the identification of those sites, we identified the places that we called endemic bird areas, places that held particular concentrations of species with very restricted ranges. And that whole effort was very successful. We identified more than 13,000 of these IBAs, important bird and biodiversity areas, across the world, and they were widely used by governments and other stakeholders.
And hugely successful and hugely influential, but they just applied to birds. So what happened next?
That's right. And so various other conservation groups and organisations adopted a very similar approach and started identifying important plant areas and important fungus areas and sites that were important for preventing extinctions. This was great, but became quite confusing for end users because you had different organisations promoting the importance of different networks of sites, many of which were overlapping or the same sites, but covered different parts of the world.
So what was the solution to that?
So the solution was to try and bring together the whole conservation community to come up with a coherent, overarching framework for identifying important places, not just for birds, but for all species, and not just for species, but for ecosystems, as well as areas that were important for ecological integrity, parts of the Congo, for example, or that were important for high irreplaceability. And we called these key biodiversity areas.
And those key biodiversity areas seem to be hugely influential in terms of identifying priorities. So how, for example, are they used?
So there are more than 16,000 across the world, and they are particularly relevant for governments and businesses. So governments are using them to help target where they locate new or expanded protected areas, and businesses are using them through something we call the Integrated Biodiversity Assessment Tool, IBAT, to screen potential business operations or investments or loans, development projects that might have disproportionate impacts on biodiversity. So, for example, the Global Environment Facility requires that any funding to support the establishment of a protected area needs to be in a key biodiversity area. And the World Bank screens all of its projects that it's lending finance to consider whether they are overlapping or close to a key biodiversity area. And if it is, then they require particular efforts to be undertaken by the lender to avoid and minimise those impacts on biodiversity.
And it seems to have had a huge impact, and you can see how that field has changed, where initially we just said, oh, we like this area, we think it's important, and a lot of the areas were sort of mountains and areas that actually weren't particularly good for biodiversity. And you, with the scientific rigour, that it has changed, so we're really selecting the important sites. And I guess also it's key that we can actually justify them. There's the underlying science.
Exactly. There is still the challenge that governments are incentivised to place protected areas and locations that are convenient, but now we have the science to show where the most important places are. And indeed, the United Nations uses metrics of the coverage of key biodiversity areas by protected areas as a measure of progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals, and the Convention on Biological Diversity is doing the same to determine progress towards Target 3 of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework.
Brilliant. Thank you.